Hi, everyone. Welcome to our third and final Theorizing at Rowan event for the spring semester of 2021. My name is Ed Kazarian. I teach in the Philosophy and World Religions Department here at Rowan University, and I'm the sort of coordinator of this series, and I'm thrilled to, frankly, be having this series and to welcome all of you to the talk. Okay, so with that said, I would like to add two other important pieces of information. The first is to introduce our speaker, and then I'm going to introduce the event itself. Let me, even before I get that far, go right ahead and also thank our co-sponsors, right? In this case, this event is presented by the Department of Philosophy and World Religions, but it is also co-sponsored by the Environmental and Sustainability Studies Program, the Rowan Center for Responsible Leadership, and the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. And we are thrilled to have had sort of, significant co-sponsorship for all of the events we've presented this semester, and we are extremely grateful for sort of the university support. Now I'd like to introduce Professor Clowney, who I think is probably known to many of you, but just in case, Professor Clowney was professor of philosophy at Rowan University for quite some time. He's now emeritus professor of philosophy. He first came to Rowan in 1988 after getting his PhD in philosophy at Temple University. He taught primarily in ethics, environmental philosophy, aesthetics, and logic, and his scholarship, which is ongoing, has largely centered around the area of environmental ethics. In particular, his current work, and from which what he's going to talk to us tonight about is a section, is an ongoing book project devoted to the idea of collective environmental virtue. And there's a lot of pieces to that, all of which are fascinating. And tonight we are tremendously grateful to have a chance to hear the politics chapter, basically, from this book. And that is, going to take the form of a lecture entitled Capitalism, Climate, and Character. So I would like to ask everyone to join me in welcoming Professor David Clowney.
Thank you, Ed. And I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my slides. Apparently, okay. There we go. There we go. That ought to do it. And this actually is it's not the politics chapter. That's chapter 3. The working title is The Way We Are. Collective Character and Environmental Crisis. And this is the chapter that's about business and capitalism and all that stuff. So it doesn't avoid politics, but it in particular gets into questions about consumption and whether the planet and the human beings on it can stand capitalism anymore or not. It's been a very hard chapter for me to write because I'm not a political scientist. I'm not an economist. I'm not a business person, although I did teach business ethics for some years. And yet I also found that I couldn't avoid it because these issues are just absolutely central to the way we live, to our way of life globally now on the planet. So without further ado, I'm going to plunge in, and I'm going to run through the first slides pretty quickly, so as to be able to get to some of the stuff toward the end. And you will see that the slideshow itself looks rather different suddenly in the middle of it because I didn't get the finish going through and making it look the way I wanted to, but the information is still there, so we will see. And I'm starting now with a quote from Martin Luther King, who said that communism forgets that life is individual. Capitalism forgets that life is social. And the kingdom of brotherhood is found neither in the thesis of communism nor the antithesis of capitalism, but in a higher synthesis that combines the truth of both. I think there's a lot of sense in what Dr. King says there, and I'll be getting to some of that in a bit. And I wanted to just give a quick update on climate so we know what we're working with or against. This is from the Washington Post just quite recently. The CO2 amount in the atmosphere has spiked now to more than halfway to pre-industrial doubling of pre-industrial levels. And that just means our time is absolutely critical. It's possible still for us to stay below the 1.5 degrees of pre-industrial warming that, excuse me a minute here, I think we lost this, that the Paris Agreement says that we're supposed to stay below, but it has to happen really, really fast. We have basically 10 years to, according to this particular, can you see the whole slide or have I? Good, okay. The United Nations Environmental Program, that's UNEP, comes out with an emissions gap report every year for the past 12 years or so that says what the difference is between the pledges that nations have made to reduce their emissions and what they've actually done, and also the gap between both of those numbers and where we really need to be to stay where everybody agrees we need to be. And what that means, to comply with that goal means that the richest 1% on the planet have to reduce their current emissions by a factor of 30, while the per capita emissions of the poorest 50% could increase by around 3 times their current level. And that means that the richest of us, or well, Americans by and large, would need to reduce, just all of us per capita need to reduce by a factor of 10. And probably it's more than that for me and most of the people on this call, which is enormous. Another way of looking at it is, if you make one transatlantic flight, you've used up your carbon budget for the year. Something to think about, which means also that the solution has to be systemic. You and I can't do it all by ourselves, but it doesn't get us off the hook. It just changes the way we have to look at what our individual responsibility is. And this is the first UN report that I've seen that is just saying, look, shifting the focus from economic growth, we got to do that, towards equity and well-being within ecological limits, is going to challenge vested interests. And it's going to be really hard to get it done because there's going to be so much resistance to it from the people in power. Here are some definitions that I'm working with. My definition of business, you'll notice, does not include anything about profits. And that's because I think business is fundamentally a social good that any complex society needs. But I want to be able to talk about it inside and outside of a capitalist framework. So I'm just calling it, to exclude the mafia, it's the socially sanctioned production and exchange of goods and services. And capitalism, more or less borrowed from Karl Marx, the form of economic organization under which the production of society's public goods and services is owned and controlled by private individuals for the purpose of increasing their wealth. And there's my definition of consumption, never mind that. But I read the definition of capitalism just to get you to stop and reflect on what's involved, what capitalism is. Now, how did we get where we are? I'm going to run way back to the 15th century, and here's where I'm going to go fast. Henry the Navigator, and I learned this from reading Ibram X. Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist and Stamped from the Beginning. He's a Portuguese prince, and for economic reasons, he decided that he wanted to cut in on the action of the Arab traders who were trading in black slaves and gold. And so he went and fought them in Ceuta and began taking over that business. I learned from reading Kendi the etymology of the word slave. I don't know how many of you know it. It comes from Slav, because up until Henry, Europeans were enslaving other Europeans and Africans were enslaving other Africans, but race wasn't involved. And then Henry's biographer gave him a nice religious excuse for his economically motivated racist activity of beginning to trade in black slaves by saying that he was pretty much the savior of these poor, benighted people, bringing them into European culture where they could, learn true religion and become cultivated and exalted in spite of being owned by white people. Just so you know. And there's a process from there of colonial activity by not just Henry, but other European nations, and an increased consumption of the resources of other nations and the people of other nations in order to enrich people in the West. And a key passage along that progress is shows the connection between war and capitalism. It also shows, I get this from D'Annunzio and others, talking about the invention of capitalist money. Point being that money, most of it in the world these days, is actually created by banks electronically. And of course, the government, the federal government prints the money or mints it and distributes it in Brinks armored trucks to various banks. But you can't go get any of it out unless you've got some of that debt with credit that's been issued as loans by banks. And this got really rolling in the 17th century when England wanted to go to war with Louis XIV, but didn't have the money to do it. And so some private investors got together and proposed that they create the Bank of England, which would then loan a whole bunch of money to the crown. The debt became pretty much permanent. The crown kept paying back to the private investors and then proposed taxes on the rest of the country in order to pay the bill. And so this is not owned, the Bank of England is not owned by the citizens of England. It's owned by investors in its beginning. And then its notes become English money. And we're still doing the same thing. There's a lot to talk about there about debt and the effect that it has and how integral it is to capitalism. And I just can't get into too much of it or that'll be the whole talk. But another stage going right along with this is the continuation of colonial exploitation, not only through the slave trade, but through the conquering, the taking over of various other cultures by European powers all around the world. The South Sea Company specifically enables English and other investors to invest in the slave trade, make money off the buying and selling of other human beings. The East India Company enables investors to profit from the extraction of resources from India and elsewhere. Thereby changing the culture of the companies, of the countries where colonial exploitation is going on and imposing European culture upon them, and also reducing their ability to grow and develop in the way that makes sense to them. And debt goes along with that. to the point now where the developing countries of the world are laboring under an unsupportable, enormous debt, where they can barely manage even to pay the interest. And in exchange for the money that they have borrowed, they're required to set up their countries in such a way that Western companies can come in and extract some more from them. Of course, the foundation of the United States is similar to that. I put Indians in quotes because they got that name just because Western explorers thought they were going to the Indies. But the United States was founded on the labor of Black people and the near extermination of the native residents of the continent. And then we get the Industrial Revolution, and everything heats up a lot more with fossil fuels. And of course, with investments, because if you're going to have a great big company, if you're going to mass produce things, in a way it's democratic, because things that used to be luxuries for the aristocracy become more widely available, especially to the merchant class. But at the same time, with the fossil fuels and the marriage of science and technology, you get mass production, but you can't have mass production and keep it going and pay back the debt that you had to acquire from the investors in order to start the business in the first place, unless you have mass consumption. And so for a while, it's the merchant class that does the consuming. And then later it becomes, people knew that the workers needed to be buying stuff too. But it took, years of struggle all the same to get unions organized to force owners to actually raise their wages. The last thing I want to point to is the 20th century invention of consumer culture. And I just want to read a little bit about that. I've gotten this from reading Stuart Ewan, All-Consuming Images. Forgive me for not looking at the screen. I've got to find this, because if I try to do it without. Okay. Ewan talks about the creation of modern advertising. Ernest Elmo Calkins and Edward Bernays, who started the PR, talked about consumer engineering. Here is Calkins writing about beauty. Beauty is introduced into material objects to enhance them in the eyes of the purchaser. The appeal of efficiency alone is nearly ended. Beauty is the natural and logical next step. It is in the air. Now you might think, well, it's a very nice thing to have consumer goods be beautiful, but that wasn't his point. Traditional Japanese culture, Western craft traditions take great pride in making things that are both useful and beautiful. But for Calkins, the idea is to make people dissatisfied with what they have of the old order, still good, useful, and efficient, but lacking in the newest touch, so they will keep wanting something new and improved all the time. And that's the beginning of consumer culture. And Bernays, in public relations, doubles down on it. And all of them are referring to Freud and Jung and Adler. They've got the methods of modern psychology at their disposal, and they want to manipulate the public. And they claim that they're doing good to the public by doing that what they're doing is in some fashion democratic. But in fact, They just get us buying more and more and more and more. Now, that gets rolling at the beginning of the 20th century. You have a period with FDR's New Deal where nevertheless the markets are constrained in a certain way and the power of business is limited by countervailing power of labor laws that tend to protect labor, by breaking up the banks so they can only operate in single states, not nationally, by dividing investment banking from ordinary mortgage lending and checking and things like that, by taxing high income at the beginning all the way up to I think it was 95% in 1944, and it stayed very high for a long time, by having antitrust laws. And this was pretty terrific for middle-class whites. So, when I was growing up, it was possible for somebody, even with a job as a pastor or a seminary professor, and certainly a line worker in a factory, to support a family, raise kids, even send them to college on a single income with a little bit of additional maybe sometimes. But it sure wasn't great for blacks. It sure wasn't great for other minorities. And during that whole time, in other countries, we were busy extracting the daylights out of countries in Latin America and elsewhere. And then you had the hard right turn under Reagan. Reagan comes in and says, no more of this stuff. Big government is the problem. Now, this is the culmination of a campaign that's detailed in Kevin Cruz's One Nation Under God, How Corporate America Created Christian America, where big business was furious about FDR and the New Deal. They hated it. And they found that preaching the gospel of free enterprise wasn't going over as well as they wanted it to with the public. So they thought they'd get religion involved. And they found somebody who would do it for them. And they funded him. And you ended up with this strange identification amongst evangelical whites, who were the most reliable voting bloc for Trump, between so-called free markets and gospel freedom. It's insane. It's, as somebody who grew up on the Bible, it's very hard for me to understand how anybody that claims to believe in it could think those two things were anything like the same. But it's sold. And so with Reagan, and that campaign comes to a climax, the New Deal is rolled back, and you get the old-time religious gloss back again. You might have noticed the halo on Henry. Here's one. Never mind about my speciesist lipstick on a pig joke. Capitalism requires continued economic growth. And that's what we have to deal with. Why does it do that? This is what I wasn't sure of when I started writing this chapter, but now I am sure. Because at the heart of capitalism is investors competing to get the best return on their investment, differential accumulation. You try to do better than the index, which is a pressure on companies to do better than their competitors or lose their investors. So it's a pressure on companies to keep growing and making more and selling more product. And when the banks create the money as loans, they don't create the interest. So if everybody that had the loans were going to retire them, they'd have to find more money somewhere. There's always a shortage of money in the economy. And so the banks have to keep making more loans, and the economy has to keep growing. And companies have to keep growing to stay ahead of the business cycle. That's more or less it. And so here's how it goes. More consumption, more economic growth, and more economic growth, more consumption. Does more consumption mean more environmental degradation? It does. And yet the United Nations doesn't always seem to think so. They keep saying that they can somehow decouple environmental economic growth from environmental destruction. How would they do that? First of all, if that's in the sustainability goals that they've adopted in 2015. The eighth sustainability goal is continued economic growth, not just for developing countries, but for everybody. They think that you can become more efficient, so you don't waste as much. They think that you can achieve some form of what they call circularity, where what you pull out of the earth, then you just keep cycling it around. One industry's waste is another industry's resources. Apple has a great big glossy page now about their intent to be circular and not use any more resources. How they're going to do that and keep, getting more and more market share as the population grows is a mystery to me. But they do have a fancy recycling project where they're going to take apart all their old computers and phones and make new ones out of them without throwing any of the guts of them out, which is pretty great. I'm glad they're doing that. But well, let me move on here. I'm suggesting, not just suggesting, I'm arguing that since capitalism requires continued economic growth, and that economic growth means more consumption, which means more using up nature and putting out our waste, we are already over the limit, obviously, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of falling water tables, in terms of biodiversity loss, in terms of deforestation, in terms of pollution. So in a way, you don't even need to argue the general case about we have to stop economic growth. And that might be a good thing, because you start arguing that case and the most powerful people that can do anything about it won't listen to you. But they're recognizing about the emissions, the water tables, the biodiversity loss, and the things we have to do to double down and actually address those problems are the very same things that we have to do to get to some form of steady state economy where we're living in harmony with nature and not using any more of nature's resources than nature can renew in a year, and not putting out in a year any more waste than nature can biologically assimilate in that year. That's where we need to be. And we need to be there in a way that we can keep the population growing till it peaks and not exceed those limits. And I said this already, our problems are systematic. Business in its PR wants to offload them onto us as individuals. That's a con. It's organized irresponsibility. It hides the actual nature of the problem and leaves it to us to try to solve it when we as individuals cannot. It doesn't get us off the hook, but it changes what we as individuals have to do. And as a point I made before in one of these talks, your footprint matters more for your credibility and your influence than it does for whatever little tiny bit it might do to make the problem better. Well, there's a little bit about what a new system a better system might look like. And we can come back to that. But I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about what we have allowed business to become and what business has made of us about the consumer economy. And here I'm using an analytic grid that I kind of halfway borrowed from Amitai Etzioni, a communitarian sociologist. Whether he'd entirely recognize it anymore, I don't know. But 3 levels of relationships. Power relations, I'm bigger than you, I control you, I'll take what I want. And the reciprocal of that is manipulation of the powerful by the downtrodden who are tricky. Then the second level is transactional relations. You've got what I want, I've got what you want, let's trade. No personal relations involved in this necessarily. And the third level is integrative or transcendent relations. And what I want to say about business is that business, which is a necessary social good, and businesses can have character, but business is essentially transactional. It operates at level 2, but it can't perform its social good unless it's embedded in a framework of values from level 3. Otherwise, it's just absolutely rich people scamming poor people to stuff their pockets. That's what it always turns into, unless society restricts it. And I want to say, too, that there's a difference between the bigger the business is, the more likely that is to happen. In pre-industrial times, businesses were embedded in such a social web in which all 3 relations interacted. That doesn't mean it was a golden age. It was nothing of the sort. The personal relations were often horrible, especially for women, for slaves, for anybody but the aristocracy. Nevertheless, there were guilds. You might have a calling to perform a particular sort of task, and your family would do it. And the relations were more personal in pre-industrial days than before the days of mass production. And it's still the case, I think, that small businesses tend to be embedded in that social, in that wider system of values. I just got examples from my own personal experience. Boaz Kim customizes harmonicas for me, and I pay him well for it, because to get them set up so I can play them the way I want to play them is expensive. I'm glad to pay him, but it's a personal relationship. And other people, I won't go more into that, but you know very well from your own experience that the people you deal with on a daily basis in small businesses, there's a relationship of trust there often, and it's not purely transactional. When you run when transactional values predominate, you get things like this. I read it in the Times this morning, I think. The textile firms are in a bind now because American customers and also the government are pressing them to not buy Chinese cotton because it's made by Uyghur slave labor or processed by it. And on the other hand, Chinese customers are outraged that we would come against China by not buying their cotton. And there's no transactional solution to that other than just, figuring you're going to lose something one way or the other and figuring out which course is going to lose you the most money, and don't do that. Do the other one instead. Whereas if you put it in a broader frame, then other principles come to bear. And I can't spend too much time on Robert Jackal's moral mazes, but he is a sociologist who interviewed some big American companies back in the 80s. And he had to work his way in there through connections. It took a long time for him to get to actually talking to people. But once they started talking, they wouldn't shut up. And they told him exactly what their moral rules in use were for the way that they operated. And it's, let's see. Yeah, here we go. I'll read to you the passage with which he concludes his book. He talks about American bureaucracy not being all formal and result-oriented so much as European bureaucracy is, but being sort of more informal and more like what you would get at court, where it's conformity to what the CEO wants that counts and what who you know. And he says, for those with the requisite discipline, the sheer dogged perseverance, the agile flexibility, the tolerance for extreme ambiguity, the casuistic discernment that allows one to dispense with shop-worn pieties, the habit of mind that perceives opportunities in others and even one's own misfortunes, the brazen nerve that allows one to pretend that nothing is wrong, even when the world is crumbling, and above all, the logic to read the inner logic of events, to see and do what has to be done. The rewards of corporate success can be very great. And of course, those who do succeed shape in a decisive way the moral rules and use that filter down through their organization. The ethos that they fashion turns principles into guidelines, ethics into etiquette, values into tastes, personal responsibility into an adroitness at public relations, and notions of truth into credibility. Corporate managers who become imbued with this ethos pragmatically take their world as they find it and try to make that world work according to its own institutional logic. They pursue their own careers and good fortune as best they can within the rules of their world. As it happens, given their pivotal institutional role in our epoch, they help create and recreate, as one unintended consequence of their personal striving, a society where morality becomes indistinguishable from the quest for one's own survival and advantage. Now, this is not somebody throwing rocks at business from the outside. This is a sociologist summarizing the results of years of conversations with three big American firms over quite a period of time, many conversations. And what that comes to is to say that, when you see a bunch of CEOs lined up before Congress, lying their rear ends off about whether nicotine is addictive, whether smoking causes cancer, whether we're causing the hole in the ozone layer, whether climate change is real, whether. It's not an exception. It's that if you rise to that level, that most of the people who rise to that level have learned to lie for a living, or they wouldn't be there. And that doesn't have to be the case, but significantly, it is the case, as Jackal lays out, and as we see time and time and time again. Now, how much time would you estimate that I've got left, Ed?
I mean, I would say you have, hold on, like 10 max.
Okay, then what I think I'm going to do, I mean, here's Milton Friedman, and he's the guru of neoliberal, or what Americans call conservative approaches to things, and that, business, the social responsibility of business, he said in a famous New York Times editorial, is to increase its profits. And other things, and government shouldn't be getting in the mix trying to make the people better either. It's what it's really best to do is to let voluntary organizations take care of all that other stuff. That's Milton Friedman. And Robert Reich comes against him, saying, the whole notion of free markets is nonsense. In any complex society, markets are created by governments. Governments set the rules. And then the question is, what are the rules going to be, and who benefits from them? I don't want to get into that, although it's a really important question. And I will say it's true that businesses can have a conscience, and I know some good examples. But what I want to just quickly run through, and here you see the slideshow changing to where I didn't get to make it look as nice as I wanted it to. But business has engineered consumptionism. That's what Calkins and Ahrens and Bernays set out to do, and they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. And here's what they have made us into. We're suckers for brand loyalty. Nike will sell you decals of its swoosh, and we're proud to have shoes and hats and t-shirts that declare to the world, I am what you're selling me. That's my identity. And brand loyalty includes looking at the business as just very, very caring, somebody that it deserves your loyalty. Here's a spot. It doesn't seem to be loading. Well, maybe it will. Yes, this is an American Petroleum Institute commercial. Look at this. Look at the woman first.
David, it's not loading for us, though. I think it's probably only loading on your computer.
What's it take to make America?
You don't see it now?
We can hear it. That's it.
Creating the fuels.
Okay. Well, if you can't see it, then I'll just describe it quickly and move on. I had an American Petroleum Institute commercial. Sorry, here. Back to, there we go. And it's this beautiful blonde woman in a dark suit against a white background. And she's just walking out talking about, how good the Petroleum Institute is for us. And, here comes a pipe and it goes down under the white surface and drills to the dark place to get the oil, but that's not going to get anywhere near us. And it just makes our life so much better. It's a commercial, natural gas is just going to, it does so much good to us. The brand loyalty gets us not facing what the companies are actually doing to us, but instead tending to support them. And here we have Kenneth Cole, who has I heard an interview with him recently on NPR, where he actually talks about himself as a brand. Now, it was a remarkable interview because he seems to be quite a decent human being who actually cares about the causes that he supports and also cares about the quality of the shoes that he made. And yet he talks about, when he's asked by the interviewer what's going to happen to his brand, he talks about himself as if he were the brand. And, he may have escaped the commodification of self that is involved in this. I think maybe in some degree he has. But we have courses taught in college about how to sell yourself. And this is business. This is life being for business rather than the other way around. We think of life as a competition and those with wealth as winners. Mariam Hamadani here has experiments on the social good, where with Stanford students, they're set up to hear two different stories. There's a group, and then there's control that hears some irrelevant story. But there's a group that hears a story about individual success against odds, and there's another group that hears a story about collective accomplishment, for the common good. And the students that hear the story about the individual success against odds do better than control on the task that is set to them afterwards. It had nothing to do with the stories. It's just, solve a logic puzzle, something like that, common psychological technique. The students who hear the story about working together for the common good, do worse than control. And the only change in that experiment is when she does it with Asian American students. And the Asian American students have enough of the Asian culture left in them, along with the American culture, that they do better on the task with either story. Something really interesting. But for sure, in capitalist world, we think of life as a competition. We care more about service than depth. Over here, you can't necessarily read it, it doesn't matter. But this is how you dress for success, including apparently down at the very bottom for a woman. Your makeup has to be new, it can't be used. I don't know, you're taking the kit with you, I guess, and you have to go buy all new stuff before you go on the interview, just in case somebody might look inside to see whether your makeup is brand new. It's like the advice that my late mother-in-law used to give, I guess, to my late wife, that you couldn't have holy or old ratty underwear because something might happen to you when you're out there and somebody would see it. But in any case, yeah, we care a lot about surface more than depth. We think of bosses as heroes. And I'm sorry not to be able to, I'll read my account of this, I guess. If I can find it. Yeah, so it's an ad for a GMC SUV. As the commercial opens, we see a quick shot of the road ahead as seen from a moving vehicle. Then there's a cut to a man headed out his front door while a voiceover narration asks, "How do you want to live? As a decent person? Not a bad guy? A good friend? Is that it? Good? Of course not. King of the hill? Better. Top of your game? Win. All powerful, like a boss, like a standard bearer, like a pro." We couldn't agree more. We are professional grade GMC. And the imagery progresses along with the voiceover. For not a bad guy, we see the man playing with his wedding ring. For a good friend, we see him as a young boy lying on the floor with his dog. For King of the Hill, he's silhouetted on a high-rise veranda, face to face with a woman. Is it his wife? Is it somebody new? What's the significance of the fact that in this context that he's white and she appears to be African American? Then he's standing next to an office window looking out over a cityscape. He's jogging. He's standing contemplatively by a lake. He's using the advertised vehicle to pull a camper. And in the last shot, as a man in his 50s or 60s, he's driving the SUV through traffic, passing other vehicles and pulling away onto the open road. That's the progress of his life from childhood to a mature age. And the pinnacle and meaning of it is not to be a good guy, a good friend, and implicitly a good husband and a father, but rather a winner, a boss, a pro out in front of the pack. It's, you know, the inversion of the growth of values and any sane trajectory of moral development is really obvious. And you can see some of the rest of these. You can just meditate on them. Flexibility replaces integrity. Productivity is the measure of success. You've put up with a lot of it at Rowan or other institutions that you teach at, having to fill out forms, having to quantify everything. It's leftovers from, efficiency management, from Taylorism. And it produces moral injury in hospitals and nursing homes and other workplaces where healthcare is involved, because you're evaluated not on how much time you spend with patients and what kind of care they actually need, but on how many patients you process through and other things like that. We think of thrift as a vice, while admiring excess and the extreme as virtues. And that is, again, deliberate on the part of Calkins and Ahrens and Bernays. They were aiming at it and they succeeded. Entrepreneurship replaces creativity and dedicated purpose. Now, there's nothing wrong with being an entrepreneur. That is one kind of thing a person can do that requires creativity and dedicated purpose. But it's not the only thing. And to use entrepreneurship as a substitute for creative, productive life, don't drink that Kool-Aid. Don't put up with that language co-optation that happens so much. We think of happiness as having stuff, and we tend to see self-development as an individualistic pursuit more than as a way of learning to live what I call, I got this from my late wife, self-fully, by claiming and developing and using the gift that you are to the world in relationship with others. In a previous talk, I talked some about what developmental psychologists have discovered about how you have a self at all, which is internalizing the regard of others, and then learning to turn so that you can look at yourself the way they might, and then being able to turn that around and look at them in that same way. But we are not the independent individuals that.
So we're at roughly at time. So I just want to let you know so we have time for Q&A.
Right. So I just want to, and so yeah, I will close now just to say that there are signs of hope. I've listed some companies in particular that I know act on principle even when it costs them. And it's because of the degree to which they are embedded in the culture of values beyond the transactional. B corporations specifically are legally chartered to care about people, profits, and to care about environment as well as people and profits. I continue to insist that moral suasion is an important force, and that to give up on it is to give up on humanity. But you can't expect big companies to get to where they need to be on that ground. It has to be by law, it has to be by regulation, it has to be by public pressure, which we have to put on them. And I just recommend the Center for Collaborative Democracy, the Democracy Project, as a place to go to look at what a new system might be like, and for some examples of people who are beginning to do it. So I think that's enough, and I will. That's never mind that.
Perfect. Let me then. We've got a couple questions, and we'll get more of them, I'm sure. I've got a couple if no one else has some, but does Nathan, Nathan Rule, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? I think I can unmute you, I believe. Let me see if I can do that. Sorry, I gotta pull this up. Sorry, 1 second.
Maybe I'll stop sharing my screen. I can always go back to
No, I can. Yeah. Where is he? Sorry. I'm trying to do this quickly. There's lots of Nathans. There he is. Okay. Oh, it's not letting me unmute. That's weird. Let me just let people unmute themselves. Okay, Nathan, go ahead and unmute yourself, and if you want to ask the question. Oh, okay. I'll just read it. Okay. So, Nathan Rule has a question. If economic growth is built on a foundation of consumption, it follows that the economies would collapse without consumption. If consumption were sustainable, then it would not change, so economies would not grow. Is sustainability even possible to achieve then from an economic perspective, or is the idea that a governing structure has to intervene in order to achieve sustainability?
Is that in the chat?
It's in the chat, yeah. If you look in the chat, it's right there.
I should look at it because I need to. Okay. I mean, the first thing to say is that I'm not saying that we can't have any more consumption. That would be ridiculous. All life forms consume resources and excrete or leave behind or both waste. And the natural system on the planet is a system in which consumption, one being's waste is food for another. The classic example that we all know about is the plants and animals, where plants give off oxygen and use carbon dioxide, and we give off carbon dioxide and use oxygen. And that's circularity. It certainly involves consumption. It certainly involves waste. But too much consumption is not sustainable. And the question is, what are the limits on the planet for the number of human beings that we're going to eventually have, for how much we as a human population can consume and how much waste we can produce? What can nature bear? But if consumption were sustainable, then it wouldn't change. Well, I mean, it has to change on some things, because we can't keep using up the biological diversity of the planet at the rate that we're doing. We have to consume less of it. Could we consume more of some other things? Maybe. The point is living within nature's limits. And sustainable is possible to achieve there, because it's been happening on the planet for many millions of years. I think that's the best answer that I can give. And behind it is the notion of trying to get an economy, a human economy, in line in some fashion with the way nature works.
Perfect. So we have Phil, Nathan has a follow-up. So do you quickly, I think we can time to do this. He just says, maybe the sustainability growth conversation needs to incorporate a notion of something like carrying capacity.
Oh, absolutely it does.
Yeah.
I didn't bother even trying to talk about that, in part because it gets very complicated, and all the most recent things that I've seen about it has a record of, amounts or estimates that vary so wildly that it hardly seems like we're anywhere near being able to know what it really is. But we do know what it is with regard to, for example, greenhouse gas emissions. And we do know what it is in some respects with regard to biodiversity loss, where we're poisoning the pollinators that make our food possible. And we do know what it is when it comes to falling water tables, and in some various other, or overfishing of the oceans. So in that respect, those very specific questions about carrying capacity are easier to answer.
So Phil Osborne has a question. Do you want to go ahead and read it, Phil? Or yeah, okay. You should be able to unmute.
Okay, so hi, Professor Clowney. I just first of all wanted to thank you very much for this talk. It was really interesting on a very important topic. So I just wanted to play a little bit of devil's advocate and say something about economic growth and if we're underselling the positive effects, because it's compound in nature. Joseph Heath has this example where, like, if you take $1,000 and invest it for like 100 years at 5% return, you end up with like $130-some thousand at the end. Now, if you increase that by 3% to say 8%, and the same 100 years, you'll end up with over 2 million. And so the concern is if we engage in climate mitigation and let's say growth is some substantial percentage lower than it would otherwise be, will that result in maybe a lot of people being poorer than they would otherwise be? And is that something we should take into consideration in the cost benefit? Thank you.
I cannot avoid thinking about that question because I am living on that very thing right now as a retired professor. And I didn't, as a kid, I would have been bewildered and amused and astonished at the notion that I had to become a millionaire in order to be able to retire safely. But that's about the size of it. I get Social Security, but beyond that, I withdraw a certain amount from my retirement funds every month, and that my funds are invested in stocks and bonds. I'm part of the system. The real question is, what kind of a system is possible that doesn't ruin the planet and doesn't oppress the poor? And, there are examples like the Mondragon system of worker cooperatives in the Basque region of Spain, which I have actually visited some years ago. The distance between the salary of a line worker and that of an executive of one of the companies, one of the co-ops, ranges between 3 and 10. Is that the highest paid executive in any of those co-ops only makes 10 times what a line worker makes. And they have their own Social Security system, and they have their own university, and they review proposals for new co-ops. And if the proposal looks good and it seems like it would be good for the people, then they go ahead and front a loan to do it, and they don't have any unemployment to speak of, because if a particular co-op shuts down or needs to lay workers off, they get moved to another co-op in the system. You might have to move house, but you will have a job, and that's been going since Franco's days. And it's the biggest. It's huge. There are 400 different co-ops, so it's possible.
So before I exercise my privilege, I will ask, are there any other questions? Is anybody else got something that they want to throw out here? No. So I'm sort of waiting to see if anything pops up here. So not seeing anybody, I'm gonna, if you can use the hand raise function too, I can see it. Okay, no hands. All right. So I'm interested in. I'm gonna push you on Marxist grounds a little bit.
Okay.
Which you probably expected this to happen. Because I think you're sort of inching your way in that direction, but not quite going all the way. In sort of interesting kind of ways. In particular, I'm really interested in this distinction you're trying to make, trying to hold open between the transactional and I see this next question, which I'll get to in a second, between the transactional and the kind of social, right? And I find that interesting because, you come back to some of the things that Marx say in the commodity fetishism discussion and Capital, where he does things like talk about how, serf labor in feudal times was actually socially transparent to the people who were engaged in it, right? Who you were producing for was, and those relationships was clear. They weren't necessarily, as you say, the greatest relationships, but people knew what the heck they were. But Marx is really emphasizes that even things that are structured by these kinds of commodified transactional relationships that are characteristic of capital are still social relationships. What they are, though, is social relationships that are mediated by objects in a way that makes them typically obscure, right? So the problem is kind of not that they're not social, that there's not a social system here. It's that it's a system that people in some level don't understand or can't understand. Right. So the relationships become in some sense invisible to us. Right.
Right.
Under this kind of a system. So I'm just wondering if the reason why I'm saying that is because I think it might work a little bit better to sort of recognize that the problem here is that there's a kind of, as you say, a lack of transparency to the social kind of conditions of production than the idea that production has just become antisocial, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. A couple things to say about that. First of all, yeah, the problem of transparency is a real problem. And in the creation of consumer culture, it's very deliberate. There's a very, very deliberate hiding of what's actually going on behind a screen that the populace is being manipulated into accepting. But your question is premised on a notion of that third level relation that I was talking about, which is different from what I have in mind.
Okay.
Transactional relationships are social. Of course they are.
Okay.
The difference in level 3 relations, as Etzioni describes them. I got this from somebody else and I haven't found it in him yet, but some of them he talks about as communitarian relations, and some he talks about as transcendent relations. But in each case, the relationship is valued for its own sake.
Right.
So that, there's something going on, say, in a good jazz band, or in a loving marriage, or in a university that's actually being a university, where you get beyond the mere sum of the individual contributions of the people involved, and the relationship itself is valued in a sense for its own sake, or what you can make. Or another way of putting it is that what you make together is more than the sum of your individual contributions. So like, people will belong to a church because they believe in the values and the doctrines, even if they don't always like the people.
And so then production becomes organized around kind of trying to preserve those kind of values, as opposed to
exactly. And there's,
okay.
This is what I have examples of from the Herman Miller Company, and from Interface Carpet Company, and from Ben and Jerry's, because very specifically, even though of course they care about profits and they want to make profits, but they will step away from the most profitable thing to do because it violates these other principles that they have.
Perfect. So I have one more question. We're taking a little extra time because we can run a little bit over, but we should also be respectful of David's time and everybody else's time. But there is one more question in chat. If you want to respond to it, I think we can do that. This is Atiash Gupta. Do you want to read it, or do you want me to just go ahead and read it? Okay. So the question is what do you think about the green economy, and in quotes, the notion that there can be an industry built around sustainability, right? So can we actually do that?
We have to. And if we're going to survive, we'll probably survive, but it would be a horrible world that we would leave to our descendants if we don't do it. Whether it's possible, whether economic growth is going to continue in the green economy, I've seen different studies on that and different opinions. There's no doubt whatever that there's going to be a huge amount of economic activity in making the transition. Building electric cars, putting up charging stations, building a lot more public transport, retrofitting buildings so that they're energy efficient, making new buildings that are energy efficient, finding ways to live more compactly in cities without driving each other crazy or killing each other when the next pandemic comes along. Redoing agriculture so you're spot irrigating instead of just spreading lots of water around, and on and on and on and on. It's a huge amount that we have to do in a very short time. So it's hard for me to believe that there won't be a burst of increased economic activity and some significant economic growth for a short period of time connected with that building of the new economy and breaking down and redoing the old economy. Whether in fact, everything has to happen so fast and so many things have to stop that I suspect that in order to have that happen fairly, you're going to have a major redistribution of wealth from the top back down to the bottom, to the pockets that it was picked out of in the first place, all around the planet and in this country. Because otherwise, say the fossil fuel workers who lose their jobs are not necessarily going to be able to quickly get other ones. How are you going to pay the healthcare workers what they really deserve, and all of that? It's a real issue. So but yeah, still, I think that there's the question of what's going to happen in the short term, and then what it can be like in the long term. And I do not see how it's possible to have continued economic growth and increasing per capita consumption and do that sustainably.
On that note, I would like to, I think I'll close the session, and I'd like to thank everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Clowney, and I'd like to ask everyone to join me in thanking Dr. Clowney. So here's just a little clap. I also would like to thank everyone who came to this session, who came to the other sessions this semester, who has sort of helped us to keep doing this, even under, less than ideal circumstances, and really who's helped us to keep doing it over, nearly a decade now. We're getting close to 10 years, which is amazing.
Didn't I give the first one?
You did. I think you gave one of the first ones. But I just want to say there will be another season, another year, in the next academic year, and we will at least be doing this in person again. But I think we might try to figure out how to stream it as well to kind of keep the sort of larger audience and the more flexible mechanisms. But all that to be announced. And thank you ever so much for everyone for hanging with us up till now. And thanks to Dr. Clowney one more time.
Thank
Take
you,
care,
all
everyone.
of you. Bye-bye.